The world needs more people with curious minds. People who aren't afraid to admit when they don't know something. We need to take the time to encourage more lifelong learners. At least that's my goal with this podcast. I think the future is at stake. But at the same time, I do believe that a more informed population can and will move humanity forward. All we have to do is keep learning. All right, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the podcast. This is Nick Learns Everything. My name is Nick Izzo, and if you're new to the podcast, this is something that I decided to start because I want to encourage people to pursue knowledge and information. I've always considered myself a lifelong learner. I enjoy researching interesting stuff that I find, and so I wanted to start this podcast to share some of the interesting things that I learn about to hopefully inspire people to do their own research. I think a more educated and informed population in general is a great way that we can move society and humanity forward. And so, my hope is that in recording myself talking about the things that I find interesting and that I learn about, I can hopefully inspire some people to take action and go try to become more informed about the type of things that you care about. I'm really excited to do this particular episode today because we're going to be discussing something that I recently learned about US history. I'm a huge fan of history. I actually started college with the intention of becoming a high school history teacher. So, any chance I get to learn about something from history, I take it. And I think that's one of the reasons that I enjoy history so much is that you can't ever learn all of it. There's just too much. Humans and humanity have been around for way too long. And you can't really learn all of it. There's always a chance to learn something new because there's just such a volume of information. So, with that being said, I recently learned about arguably the most controversial and contentious presidential election of all time. And guess what? It isn't the one that we're currently going through. I know it's hard to believe, but I think another factor that speaks to the importance of learning history is the fact that it really does consistently repeat itself. We're currently living through a period of time where we keep hearing the phrase, these are unprecedented times. You hear that everywhere. Anyone you talk to, somebody's saying, man, wild times, or these times are unprecedented, something along those lines. And they are unprecedented for us regarding our life experience as a society because there isn't anyone alive who's experienced these particular things before. However, that doesn't mean these things have actually never happened before. For example, we did have a flu pandemic in 1917. So the COVID pandemic's only unprecedented through our own individual lenses as people who are alive today. But the pandemic itself is absolutely not unprecedented in US history. And I think that distinction is really important. We also sit here today on a day where the current president has contracted COVID, which is the cause of the pandemic. And yet, that same thing has also happened before. In 1918, Woodrow Wilson was president and he contracted the flu during the Spanish flu epidemic of 1917. And so I think things are unprecedented oftentimes, or they're described as unprecedented oftentimes. And that worries a lot of people. That those are the types of things, the unprecedented things that freak everyone out. It's the unknown that scares people. It's that feeling of being the first group to ever be faced with some type of challenge, and that's what makes people panic. But I think the more you understand history, the less daunting our current day problems seem, because you start to get this understanding that you're going through something that people with less technology, less information, less education, less of a historical context, all those things people with less of all of that already overcame some of the same challenges that we face today. And when you're able to study history, I think it's a little easier to wrap your mind around that. And honestly, I think that that is something that makes these current day challenges seem less daunting. So, my hope is that maybe this episode can help draw some parallels between now and the election of 1876. And I'm thinking that this episode will probably be able to provide you with some perspective and some historical context in regards to our current election. And some of these parallels are really crazy. So I'm really excited to get into it. So I'd like to start our story with a little bit of framing. Leading up to the election in 1876, the United States is 11 years removed from the Civil War. The patent for the telephone has just been given to Alexander Graham Bell. General Custer has lost the Battle of Little Bighorn to Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse in what is known as the Indian Wars. And the American economy is still dealing with the effects of the Depression that followed the Panic of 1873. Interestingly enough, at the time, they actually called the Panic of 1873 the Great Depression. The Great Depression that we know that happens later, that's what we refer to it as. But back then, in 1876, they were referring to the Panic of 1873 as literally the Great Depression because of how bad it was for them. It's also important to note that the political parties back then were very different than they are today, even though they had the same names. So just keep that in mind when I mention Republicans and Democrats. They're not exactly the same parties back then as they are currently, so I don't want you to get too wrapped up in that. But anyway, so we start our story with that framing. So you kind of have an idea of what the country looks like at that time. So prior to the Democrat and Republican Party conventions in 1876, President Ulysses S. Grant actually considered running for a third term. And there seems to be a clear indication that he knew he could win that nomination in the Republican Party, but he ultimately didn't think he could go on to win the presidency for a third term. And George Washington had set that precedent of stepping down after two terms. However, it wasn't until the 22nd Amendment was ratified in 1951 that it actually became unconstitutional to run for a third term. To this day, FDR is the only president to serve more than two terms, and that was because of World War II. The constitutional amendment came after World War II. So Grant had considered running for a third term, which, while it was sort of an unwritten rule, wouldn't have been illegal at that time. But he decided not to. So in 1876, part of the reason that he didn't want to run for that third term was because his administration was getting criticized all the time. There was a bunch of different scandals, a ton of corruption going on in his administration. And the economy was in really bad shape because of the Panic of 1873, like I mentioned. So instead, the Republicans chose Rutherford B. Hayes, who was at the time the governor of Ohio. And he ran on a platform that's very interesting because he ran on an anti corruption platform. And that's fascinating because it was his party at the time that was constantly being reported about being very, very corrupt. But he ran on this anti corruption platform. And the Democrats chose a man named Samuel Tilden, who was the governor of New York. And he was known as a bourbon Democrat, which I learned was a portion of the Democratic Party at that time who believed in liberalism. And once again, I remind you that it's not the same thing as modern day liberalism. At the time, bourbon Democrats were in favor of conservative government, anti imperialism, and the gold standard. Now, Tilden is also the guy who put Boss Tweed in jail and ended Tammany Hall's corruption in New York City. And I'm not going to go into a deep dive on that, but we'll just touch on that here in a little bit. But anyway, if this election wasn't already fascinating enough, it also included a guy named Peter Cooper, who was nominated by the Greenback Party. And at the age of 85 years old, he was at the time and still is to this day the oldest person ever nominated by any political party for president of the United States. And I mean, at 85 years old in 1876, you were basically a billion years old. For reference, if you look at the US Census, the top three leading causes of death in the United States in 1890 were tuberculosis, pneumonia, and diarrhea. So the fact that this dude lived that long when people were being taken out left and right literally by diarrhea is an astonishing thing. Not to mention the fact that the Greenback Party nominating an 85-year-old man at that time would be like if the libertarians today rolled out a dude who was 105 years old. Now, Peter Cooper isn't going to be a huge factor in this episode, but I mean, come on, like, how could I not mention that guy? The Greenback Party itself is also interesting as hell, and I might do an episode about them later on in the future because I did learn a lot about them, but they're just not going to be super prevalent in this story, so we're just going to move on for right now. So the campaign began, and for the most part, the candidates didn't campaign a lot. They let their supporters do a lot of that for them. And it's at this point that I want to read a quote from this amazing article written on this topic that I read. It was published in Smithsonian Magazine by a writer named Gilbert King in 2012. So King writes, quote, "Throughout the campaign, Tilden's opposition had called him everything from a briber to a thief to a drunken syphilitic. Suspicion of voter fraud in the Republican-controlled states was rampant, and heavily armed, marauding white supremacist Democrats had canvassed the South, preventing countless blacks from voting." I mean, come on. We're talking about negative political campaigns in the media, bold-faced lies about candidates. There's allegations of voter fraud, armed militias, white supremacists, and attempted voter suppression. So, if you think the 2020 election is still unprecedented, I do not know what to tell you. It basically already happened. And trust me, this story is going to get a lot crazier. Now, admittedly, a big difference between now and then is the fact that both candidates actually agreed on a bunch of stuff, and they both really wanted to end corruption in politics. And it wasn't just a political talking point. Both Hayes and Tilden actually had the track record to prove it, especially Tilden. Like I said, I can't go into Tilden's anti corruption record right now because we'll be here for the next few hours. But if you have some free time, just take a minute to Google Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall. And remember that Tilden is the one who helped to put Boss Tweed in jail. So, anyway, both candidates basically agreed on a ton of stuff. They saw things very similarly, which, once again, super rare nowadays, but back then they agreed on most of the issues. The main difference that they had was in regards to Reconstruction in the South. And once again, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but I'm not going to be able to fully dive into an explanation of Reconstruction right now because we'll be here forever. And that's not really my goal on this podcast, is to have 3 and 4 hour podcasts. But essentially, the Republicans and Hayes wanted to keep military protection for black rights in the southern states, especially the one that Republicans controlled, like Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. Remember, we're only 11 years after the Civil War right now. So the Republican Party wants to keep those, or that military protection in those states. Now, the Democrats, on the other hand, want to move past the Civil War. They take the sort of stance that the Republicans keep bringing up the Civil War, but that happened 11 years ago, right? It would be like somebody still trying to run on like a 9/11 type of platform today. And that's kind of the way that they framed their argument was, let's move past the Civil War and let the local governments and the state governments deal with the local issues, such as protection for black Southerners. Now, this raised a lot of questions for me because it seems like at that time, most of the South was run by Democrats. And it seemed like they wanted to remove the federal protection for black people for way more nefarious reasons. And you can see why black people in the South at the time wanted the Republican Hayes to win, because they wanted to ensure that they could get that federal military protection from the former slave owners that still lived near them. They still resided in the South after the Civil War. And this is where things really start to get crazy. So the Democrats knew that the black population in the southern states do not want them to win because it's going to remove that military protection. So what the Democrats do is they essentially deputize KKK members to go around in a sort of official government capacity as a cover, and they basically just intimidate black voters. The Democrats also use different ballots in some of those southern states, which is nuts, as a way to take advantage of the fact that those former slaves, a lot of them couldn't read. And so what they would do is they would use a picture of Abraham Lincoln on the ballot to represent the Democrat choice. Even though Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, they knew that people who couldn't read would see Abraham Lincoln on the ballot and be more likely to vote for that choice, which was them on those ballots. And basically, they would be voting for a Democrat by accident. They would just manipulate it so that, someone who is living in the South at that time and can't read is looking and being like, well, I like Abraham Lincoln. And so they'll just vote for him. And in fact, that's a vote for the Democrats. Now, meanwhile, the Republicans are not without blame here. Also, there's plenty of scandals going on that side of things as well. The Republican led state legislatures at the time, they controlled the election in some of these Republican states. And what they started to do was they would just disqualify ballots that were ballots casting votes for Democrats. And they would give no reason. It was all unspecified reasons. And there were even instances where these Republican states would claim that certain parts of their states had more votes than for the Republican candidate, Hayes, then there were even people in the population in that area. They would be submitting these ballots where, say, you had 500 people living in a certain township. They'd be submitting these ballots with like 600 or 700 votes for Hayes. So they were just stuffing ballot boxes. And so you can see there's a ton of corruption going on both sides in this election. So it's important to note that at this point in our history, a candidate needed to secure 185 electoral votes to become president. Now, towards the end of election night, Tilden, the Democrat, had 184 electoral votes. He was literally one vote short. And Hayes had 165 electoral votes. Now, at this point, you're getting to the end of election night. There are 20 electoral votes that are being contested. And those votes are in the states of Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, which are Republican-run states at this point. Now, Hayes, like I said, is only one vote short. So he only needs to get one of those 20 electoral votes, and he wins the presidency. Meanwhile, Tilden was one vote short, rather. So Tilden only needs one electoral vote to become president. Hayes would need to sweep all 20 votes. He would need to get all 20 to get to 185, and that would allow him to win 185 to 184. And it's at this point that I want to turn back to that Smithsonian article that I talked about, because I think the author does such a great job of summarizing things. So here's what he says, quote, "At the end of the night, and although Tilden captured the popular vote, the newly reconstructed states of Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, still under federal occupation, hung in the balance. The Republican Party, which controlled the canvassing boards, quickly challenged the legitimacy of those states' votes, and on a recount, supposedly supervised by personal agents who were dispatched to these states by President Grant, who, remember, was a Republican, along with federal troops, many of Tilden's votes began to be disqualified for unspecified irregularities. Democrats had no doubts Republicans were stuffing ballot boxes and claimed there were places where the number of votes exceeded the population. Most egregious was Louisiana's alleged offer by the Republican controlled election board. For the sum of $1 million, it would certify that the vote had gone to the Democrats. The Democratic National Convention rejected the offer, but similar reports of corruption on both sides were also reported in Florida and South Carolina. After all three contested states submitted 2 sets of electoral ballots, one for each candidate, Congress established an electoral commission in January of 1877. So this is the election happens in November. This is now January. They're working through this. Now, that commission is made up of 5 senators, 5 Supreme Court justices, and 5 members of the House of Representatives. The commission, 7 Republicans and 7 Democrats, or 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and 1 independent, heard arguments from lawyers who represented both Hayes and Tilden. Associate Justice Joseph P. Bradley of New Jersey emerged as the swing vote in the decision to name the next president of the United States. Now, Bradley cast the deciding vote, and what's interesting about him is the fact that he wasn't even originally on the commission. He was the independent that was added to the commission because the commission had chosen another independent Supreme Court justice. However, the state of Illinois corruptly named him to the Senate because back then the state leadership picked the senators, and that removed him from the commission. And that guy, I believe his name was like David Davis, one of those double name type of fellas. He was something along those lines. He was a very, very, very independent fellow. He was considered by everyone at the time to be a very independent guy, a nonpartisan person. He gets named to the Senate, so they remove him from the commission and replace him with Joseph Bradley, who was actually seen at the time as leaning Republican rather than being independent. And sure enough, the commission voted to allow all 20 of those contested electoral votes to go to the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes, and he was named president. So we go back to the Smithsonian article. However, the Democrats threatened a filibuster, which would delay the completion of the election process and put the government in uncharted waters. The threat brought Republicans to the negotiating table, and over the next 2 days and nights, representatives from both parties hammered out a deal, the so-called Compromise of 1877. And that compromise would remove federal troops from the South, a major campaign issue for the Democrats, in exchange for the dropped filibuster. The compromise enabled Democrats to establish a, quote, solid South. With the federal government leaving the region, states were free to establish Jim Crow laws, which legally disenfranchised black citizens. Frederick Douglass observed that the freedmen were quickly turned over to the, quote, rage of our infuriated former masters. As a result, the 1876 presidential election provided the foundation for America's political landscape as well as race relations for the next 100 years. While Hayes and the Republicans presumptively claimed rights to victory, Tilden proved to be a timid fighter and discouraged his party from challenging the commission's decision. Instead, he spent more than a month preparing a report on the history of electoral counts, which in the end had no effect on the outcome. And this election was the closest electoral college victory of all time, and still is. Rutherford B. Hayes literally won 185 electoral votes to 184 electoral votes. And what's interesting about this as well is at the time, Colorado had just become a new state, and they were awarded 3 electoral votes. And at the time, it was a Republican-led state, and so those electors pledged their electorate votes to the Republicans basically up front. And I was doing a little bit of research on this. I don't want to speak too specifically on it, but It was some situation happened along the lines where after that happened, they changed the way that the electors were distributed because of that, because it seemed to be a very corrupt situation that happened in Colorado. And those three electoral votes going to Rutherford B. Hayes, before we ever got into the contested votes in the South, if one of those votes, let alone all three, had gone to Tilden, Tilden wins the presidency before we even get to those contested votes. So that ended up being a big factor as well. But anyway, it was the closest electoral college victory of all time. And interestingly enough, just like in 2016, the loser of the election, which was Tilden, actually won the popular vote. He just couldn't pull off that electoral college victory. And Tilden, interestingly enough, actually won the popular vote by a larger margin in 1876 than Hillary Clinton won it by in 2016, just to give you some context. But I do think Tilden had a really fantastic quote after the election in which he said, quote, "I can retire to public life with the consciousness that I shall receive from posterity the credit of having been elected to the highest position in the gift of the people, without any of the cares and responsibilities of the office." And to me, that quote is very important because I think it's very prevalent today. I think a lot of the time, supporters of politicians don't realize that those politicians themselves are not as concerned with the outcome of the election as their supporters seem to be, or as their supporters think that they are. For you to be able to ascend to the level of power that allows you to become a candidate for president means you already have more information and leverage, even if you lose, than most of the people alive on the earth today. And Tilden died a wealthy man, and I think sometimes that's lost on people. Politicians ultimately sat in a room and probably made a bunch of under the table deals to get the Compromise of 1877 done. And at the end of the day, it ultimately benefited them and only them. If you look at all the problems that come from that compromise, it's very disheartening because they essentially sat in a room together and made a bunch of deals that really screwed over the American people, especially black people in America. And the Compromise of 1877 changed America moving forward, and it definitely didn't change it for the better. And I don't think this episode is supposed to make you necessarily feel great because when I learned about this, honestly, my feelings were, you've got to be kidding me. How the hell do things feel the same as they did 150 years ago? How are we dealing with the same problems in a presidential election? But I do think it serves as a reminder that we've been through contentious elections before. We've been through controversial elections before. And back in 1876, the population didn't have nearly the transparency and ability to communicate like we do today. And so that gives me some hope. And maybe we can learn from this history so that we don't ever have to repeat it. Either way, like I said at the beginning of this episode, things in the world are a lot less unprecedented than you probably think they are. And at least for me, I find some peace in that fact. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you do, please subscribe to the podcast, share it with your family and friends. I appreciate all of you for listening. At the end of the day, like I always say, don't take anything I say too seriously. I mean, what the hell do I know? I wasn't alive when people were dying of diarrhea left and right, and maybe the fear of death by pooping made people smarter. I don't know. So don't take anything I'm saying here too seriously. I'm just a guy looking stuff up on his laptop. As always, want to make a shout out to my family and friends. I just want to make sure I end every show with that seriously. Thanks to all the people that got me here. And I'll see you guys next time. Until then, keep asking questions. Don't be afraid to admit when you don't know something. And continue to be hopeful. I think that the more that we can, like I said, become an educated population, I think the more at peace we will find ourselves, the more hopeful we can be for the future of humanity and of society. I'll see you guys next time.